Thanks for coming along tonight on this warm Sydney night where Paul Fletcher makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. He's been here in previous roles, including as a minister in government, but on this occasion, the Honourable Paul Fletcher, the Shadow Minister for Science, Arts, Government Services and the Digital Economy. And the topic for tonight is why majority government is in the national interest and the Teals are not. Paul Fletcher, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. It's great to be here with you and Anne and all the members of the Sydney Institute, which of course for decades has been a very important forum for considered public policy debate. Well, tonight I want to argue in favour of majority government. That's to say, a House of Representatives in which one political party has at least 76 of the 150 seats. We hear plenty of talk that a parliament filled with Teals, or as they call themselves, community independents, is a good thing. I'm here to argue that it's unambiguously a bad thing. I want to start by arguing that the Teals are a giant green left con job. It's remarkable what a soft run this big money political exercise and its backers, such as Melbourne billionaire's son Simon Holmes à Court, have been given by many political journalists in Australia. Next, I want to look at the track record of the Teals in Parliament and the disconnect between what they promised and what they've done. Lastly, I want to argue that majority government is a good thing, but it is at real threat due to the Teals. Let me turn first to the giant green left con job perpetrated on the Australian electorate by Melbourne billionaire's son Simon Holmes à Court and a group of other wealthy people. Of course, this is far from the first time the organised left has established front groups to run in elections which are not branded as Labor or Greens. Look at GetUp, which has been a presence in Australia for at least 15 years. Bill Shorten was one of the founders of GetUp and served on its board for many years. The rationale of GetUp is to deliver money and resources into elections in a way which makes it harder for coalition candidates to get elected. GetUp's 2019 post-election report boasts of its contribution towards defeating incumbent Liberal MP Tony Abbott in Warringah, for example. Another recent example of a left-wing front group is the Australian Recreational Fishers Party, founded by an ex-Labor candidate, which ran candidates in 3 Tasmanian seats in 2016. It was a single-issue party tapping concerns about so-called super trawlers operating in Tasmanian waters. In Lions, its candidate received 6.3% of the first preference vote. When she was eliminated, almost 2/3 of her votes flowed to Labor or the Greens. The Liberal candidate Eric Hutchison, defending a margin of just 1.2%, was defeated. The Teals then are very much in the tradition of front groups established by left-wing political operatives which are designed to lure votes away from the Liberal Party by tricking voters about the bona fides. As with other groups over time, many of the campaign volunteers are members of unions or the Labor Party or the Greens political party and have simply put on a different T-shirt for a few weeks. That being said, one of the big differences with the Teals is the scale of the money involved. Just to remind you, in the 2022 election, they spent $2.1 million in Kooyong, $2.1 million in Wentworth, and across the 6 seats they won, they spent almost $10 million. These amounts being spent on campaigns in individual electorates are without precedent in the Australian political system. If the Liberal Party had done the same thing, there would have been screams of protest from the media and others about the Americanisation of our politics. This is but one of the many pieces of evidence that the Teals are not a grassroots community movement. They are a carefully designed and centrally controlled clique, backed by big money and a sophisticated campaign apparatus. Let me remind you what we know about them. They ran a highly advanced national polling operation coordinated by Cos Samaras, previously the long-term Assistant Secretary of the Labor Party in Victoria. They used a well-known progressive campaign agency based in New York, Populares, to develop their messages. They were backed by Climate 200, a political funding vehicle, whose chief executive, Byron Fay, has previously worked for organisations like Climate Strategy Advisors and for a Joe Biden-aligned political action committee during the 2020 US presidential campaign. The look and feel of the Teal campaigns, the graphic design, the slogans, the t-shirts, the photography, the videography, was extremely slick. It was also highly consistent across multiple electorates. So too, their key campaign issues were consistent across multiple electorates: climate change, an anti-corruption commission, and the treatment of women in politics. There is an evident and obvious tension between claiming to be, in lots of different electorates, a genuine grassroots-based community movement and campaigning on identical issues in each of those different electorates. Of course, it's no accident that these issues were deployed across multiple campaigns. They were chosen through extensive and expensive polling work across the country. We know Climate 200 also used a team of specialist lawyers from Mark Lawyers to support this integrated national campaign. So it's no surprise that they used the same standard set of tactics in different electorates. To give one example, in late April 2022, The Age reported that, quotes, "Guide Dogs Victoria will investigate why its chief executive appeared in Liberal Party election pamphlets endorsing Treasurer Josh Frydenberg in his inner Melbourne seat of Kooyong." This story was triggered because Climate 200 followed a specific tactic of complaining to the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission if a Liberal candidate issued a brochure containing an endorsement by an executive of an organisation regulated by the ACNC. I know this because they did exactly the same thing in my community of Bradfield, where I issued a brochure containing endorsements from several respected community figures, including the manager of a local Lifeline branch, which was then the subject of a complaint. Of course, one of the other big problems with the claim of being genuine community independence is that the Teals, without exception, ran in seats which had historically been Liberal or National seats. That's true of the seats they won: Mackellar, Warringah, Wentworth, North Sydney, Goldstein, Kooyong and Curtin. It's also true of other seats they ran in: Boothby, Bradfield, Killare, Casey, Clark, Cowper, Flinders, Grey, Hughes, Mayo, Page and Wannon. This is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence of the Teals being a green left con job. These so-called spontaneous community movements, by apparently complete coincidence, appeared in a range of Liberal and National seats and made no appearance in Labor seats. Every aspect of the Teal campaign was carefully designed to dupe traditional Liberal voters. Is it a coincidence that in a third of the new seats they won in 2022, the Teal candidate was the daughter or niece of a long-term Liberal MP with the same last name? Of course it's not a coincidence. It was part of a deliberate plan. The strategy was clear: to appeal to traditional Liberal voters who would never vote Labor, but who were disenfranchised with the coalition after some tough years of COVID and all its consequences. The intention was to get people to think, that nice Teal candidate could almost be a Liberal, I'll vote for her. Such trickery backed by big money has a long tradition in so-called progressive politics. In John F. Kennedy's first campaign to win a House seat from Massachusetts, one of the Democratic primary opponents was Joseph Russo, a popular city councillor. So the uber-wealthy financier Joseph Kennedy, father of John F. Kennedy, paid for another man with exactly the same name to run in the primary. With two men named Joseph Russo on the ballot paper, neither got enough votes to win. Instead, John F. Kennedy won. The Teal strategy was backed by very specific campaigning practices designed to create the sense of a mass community movement. There were several standard tricks in their playbook. One was to have a big launch with several hundred people, all wearing the same t-shirt, safe in the knowledge that no one is ever going to be able to check if the same activists turn up at similar launches for several different Teal candidates. Another was to have people, in some cases campaign volunteers, in other cases paid operatives, wandering around in shopping malls and public spaces wearing the candidate's t-shirt. This was all about demonstrating social proof. Humans are social animals. They're more likely to vote for a candidate if they think lots of other people are thinking the same way. For the same reason, the Teals had a focus on getting a large number of campaign posters in homes across the electorates they were targeting. Yet another feature of this Green Left con job was a deliberate strategy to leverage the operation of Australia's preferential voting system. If Australia had a first-past-the-post system, none of the 6 Teals who entered the Parliament in 2022 would have been elected. Of the 6, most had a first preference vote which was only in the 30s or even 20s, a long way behind the first preference vote secured by the Liberal candidate. In North Sydney, for example, the Liberal candidate Trent Zimmerman received 38.1% of the first preference vote. The Teal candidate received only 25.2%. But the way the Teals won, of course, was by rolling up all of the preferences from non-Liberal candidates. It's also clear that the Teal first preference vote came from 2 sources: former Liberal voters and Labor and Greens voters who were voting tactically. In North Sydney, for example, the Liberal first preference vote dropped from 52% in 2019 to 38.1%. This block of almost 14% of votes cast moved from the Liberal candidate to the Teal candidate. But of the other 11% received by the Teal, to achieve that total of 25.2%, 5.1% came from Greens voters and 3.6% from Labor voters. That is, the Greens vote dropped from 13.6% to 8.6%, and the Labor vote dropped from 25.1% to 21.5%. Left-wing voters saw a chance to unseat a Liberal incumbent and voted in large numbers to do so. They knew that if the Teal candidate could successfully attract votes from Liberal voters who saw the Teal as almost a Liberal, then the Teal was more likely to be successful than someone running under a Labor or Greens banner. In North Sydney, for example, the proportion of previous Greens voters who moved across to the Teal candidate was around 1 in 3, significantly higher than the proportion of previous Liberal voters who made that move, which was 1 in 4. Well, I want to turn now to what we know about the Teals from the way that they've operated in the Parliament for the last 2.5 years. This is important because in the 2022 election, the Teal candidates were largely an unknown quantity. They made vague promises about doing politics differently, with vacuous claims such as better is possible. But there was very little information about what they actually stood for. 2.5 years later, things are very different. The Teals have cast hundreds of votes in Parliament. Recently, I asked the Parliamentary Library to give me a report on their voting record. That report shows that the great majority of times, the Teals are lining up with the radical, extremist Greens Party. If you look at substantive votes on bills, which if passed become laws with binding legal effect, Kate Chaney voted with the Greens 73% of the time, Zoe Daniel voted with the Greens 81% of the time, and the other 5 all voted with the Greens between 74% and 80% of the time. Even on procedural motions, such as that the motion be put or that the member be no longer heard, the 7 Teals voted with the Greens between 69% and 77% of the time. Let me give some examples. In February 2023, every Teal MP voted with the Greens against legislation supported by both Labor and the Coalition, which strengthens the character test in circumstances where a non-citizen has committed multiple criminal offences. The change allows these multiple offences to be added together in determining whether the non-citizen fails the character test and can therefore be denied an Australian visa. So the major parties both voted yes, the Greens and the Teals voted no. In October 2023, just 9 days after the appalling Hamas terrorist attack, in which more than 1,400 innocent people were murdered by terrorists in Israel, Kylie Tink and Sophie Scompes joined forces with the Greens to accuse Israel of committing war crimes. The House was considering a motion which contained the following as paragraph 2, that this House stands with Israel and recognises its inherent right to defend itself. The Greens moved an amendment to delete this paragraph and replace it with the following. 2, condemns war crimes perpetrated by the State of Israel, including the bombing of Palestinian civilians, and calls for an immediate ceasefire between all parties and an end to the war on Gaza, recognising also that for there to be peace, there must be an end to the State of Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories. Teal MPs Kylie Tink and Sophie Scompes voted in favour of this amendment. Those Australians who voted for a Teal candidate on the premise that that nice Teal candidate could almost be a Liberal were certainly not expecting to get an MP who voted largely with the Greens. Nor is it likely they were expecting an MP who would push for new and higher taxes. But that's what Teal MPs like Zoe Daniel have been doing. She told the Sydney Morning Herald in September this year she'd been calling for an everything on the table, independent review of tax since before she was elected. Quotes, negative gearing is just one piece of this. We're going to have to think much bigger to fix the housing crisis, close quotes. Mackellar Teal, Sophie Scomps, has similarly come out against the current negative gearing rules, according to a recent Herald article where she said that in a forum with voters in Mackellar, there was support for tax changes. She was quoted as saying, quotes, the most popular solution with almost unanimous support was for a paring back of the tax rules that give real estate investors an unfair advantage over first home buyers, close quotes. Her activism against negative gearing would no doubt come as an unpleasant surprise to the 6,300 taxpayers in Mackellar who lodged a tax return claiming a deduction for losses on a rental property. Of course, what also stands out is that while the Teals made big promises to do politics differently, they've made zero practical difference in the House of Representatives. Labor has had a majority since the May 2022 election, so it wins every vote. It does not need to negotiate with the Teals. The presence of the Teals, however, makes it vastly easier for Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party to govern. Labor won with just 77 seats. If all remaining 74 seats were held by the coalition, and Labor thus had only 76 votes after taking out one MP to be Speaker, every division would be a knife-edge exercise. But with the non-Labor seats divided between the coalition and a crossbench of 18, Labor can relax in the knowledge that on any given vote, it's extremely unlikely that all of the crossbench will even turn up, let alone vote the same way as the coalition. Labor's taken advantage of the presence of the Teals to weaken the scrutiny and accountability that it would otherwise face. To take one example, during the Morrison government, the then Labor opposition was typically given the opportunity to ask between 9 and 10 questions in each question time. Prime Minister Albanese, by contrast, typically shuts down question time after the opposition has had only 6 or at most 7 questions. The reason he can get away with this is that Labor changed the House of Representatives standing orders to guarantee a certain number of questions to the crossbench. The practical consequence of this decision has been to reduce scrutiny. The opposition has shadow ministers, each with specialist responsibilities and knowledge, and typically with many years of parliamentary experience. If an issue is running in a particular portfolio, a shadow minister asking a series of questions in question time on that issue can have a considerable impact. But it's much harder to have that impact when the total number of questions available across the whole of question time is only 6 or 7 and not 9 or 10 as it was previously. It's very much suited Labor to have the Teals in the Parliament, and Labor's been very careful to dole out small political rewards to each of the Teals. For example, Labor introduced the Climate Change Bill in 2022 to establish a target of a 43% reduction in emissions by 2030. And Labor took particular care to accept and support 5 different amendments, each moved by a different Teal MP, Monique Ryan, Zoe Daniel, Kylie Tink, Allegra Spender and Zali Steggall. So each could tell their constituents they had had a win. It was transparently orchestrated. I've argued today that the Teal candidates won by pretending to be something that they're not, and their track record in Parliament shows a big difference between what many of those who voted for them thought they were getting and what they actually got. Well, some would say this is simply bleating from a member of a political party which lost seats to a disruptive new entrant. But I think the issues are more serious. My argument is that majority government is a good thing in Australia, and the Teals constitute the most serious threat to majority government in 80 years. The Teals' message, implicitly or explicitly, is the opposite of my argument. According to them, majority government is something of no value, and if we no longer have it, that's nothing to worry about. Of course, as I pointed out, the Teals are a Green left con job. Actually, the political operatives behind the Teals have a strong interest in majority government. They just want it to be a Labor majority government. With one exception, Australia has had majority government at the federal level continuously since 1943. That exception, of course, was the 2010 to 2013 period, which brought unprecedented instability and uncertainty. May I remind you that it brought us Labor relying on the vote of Craig Thomson, who was at the time under suspicion of, and who was later convicted of, theft and deception in relation to the misuse of funds from the Health Services Union, of which he'd earlier been secretary. Labor appointing disgruntled ex-LNP MP Peter Slipper as Speaker before he was forced to resign following allegations of inappropriate behaviour. Multiple leadership challenges against Julia Gerard in February 2012, March 2013 and June 2013. Each of the four crossbenchers securing commitments to various pet projects such as poker machine reform, pressed by Andrew Wilkie, and imposing a carbon tax, pressed by Adam Bant and the Greens, despite Prime Minister Gillard having promised that there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. We also saw Andrew Wilkie withdrawing his guarantee of confidence and supply in January 2012, and the Greens ending their alliance with Labor in February 2013. And fundamentally, what we saw amid all the chaos was a government which performed very poorly on its key responsibilities, including economic management and protecting the border against illegal maritime arrivals. The first bad consequence of not having majority government then is that it leads to chaotic processes and regular, abrupt changes of policy direction and of key personnel. The second bad consequence is that unless a Prime Minister has a clear majority in the House of Representatives, it's virtually impossible to achieve substantive reform. We regularly hear the refrain that today's politicians are mere pygmies, too timid to deliver big changes, unlike the giants of earlier times. Hawke and Keating lowered tariffs and floated the dollar. Howard and Costello reformed our tax system and introduced the GST. All true and to be celebrated, but none of it can happen without having a majority government. Getting the GST through, for example, came at a significant political cost to the Howard government. It went from 94 seats to 80 seats in the 1998 election. Without having a strong majority, when it commenced the process of introducing the GST, the Howard government would never have succeeded with this reform. I noticed Allegra Spender giving a speech at the Press Club the other day in which she expanded on her big plans for economic reform. That's great, but she gave no answer to the question of how she, as an independent, would be able to deliver such reform. Unless you are a government with a strong and stable majority, significant reform is very unlikely to be achieved. I've argued that a parliament in which independents have a significant presence and in turn no one party has a majority means in turn a weak government, and that's bad for Australia. I want finally to turn to why it's a good thing that voters have before them major party candidates to choose from, as opposed to independent candidates. As I argued earlier, the way the Teals have voted in the Parliament on many issues would likely come as a surprise to quite a few of the people who voted for them. The big downside with voting for an independent is that you do not know what you are going to get. There's no requirement for them to be clear or explicit about who they are and what they stand for. The major parties are different. We have track records built up over 80 or more years. When you vote Liberal, you know you are voting for a party which has consistently supported smaller government, lower taxes and a strong approach to border protection and national security. When you vote Labor, you know you're voting for a bigger spending, higher taxing party with a bigger role for the unions. I'm critical of Labor for many things, but I do not criticise them for hiding who they are or what you're going to get. By contrast, I'm very critical of the Teals, the so-called community independents, for simply concealing from Australians what they intended to do and who they intended to support. And I'm equally critical of the big money funders of this cynical Green Left con job. There's plenty of criticism of the two major parties as a duopoly, but the fact is many Australians value the known quantities that we represent. As one factoid which I think supports this claim, in Bradfield in the 2022 election, Labor came third for the first time, so the preferences of Labor voters were distributed. In some boos in the northern end of the electorate, up to 1/3 of the preferences of Labor voters came to me as the Liberal candidate. I interpret that as a vote for the stability that the two-party system offers. The Teals at the last election told us that their priorities were climate change, an anti-corruption commission and the treatment of women in politics. But voters had no idea what their views and plans were on government spending, on more or fewer public servants, on how they'd get inflation under control, whether they'd be strong or weak on border protection, and a whole host of other issues. Nor can you be sure that if you vote for one particular Teal candidate, any policy commitments she makes will be binding on the others. The party discipline of the major parties, by contrast, means that if you vote for a Liberal candidate, you can be confident he or she will support the policies that Peter Dutton or other Liberal frontbenchers announce. In practice, the most important thing you need to know if you're voting for an independent is which party they would support to form government if neither major party gets 76 seats or more. The Teals were scrupulously silent on that question in the 2022 election. At a time when Australia is facing serious challenges, a vote for an independent is a vote for somebody who does not tell you what their plan is and who has no consistent or reliable way to implement their plan. In the specific circumstances of the 2025 election, a vote for an independent is almost certainly a vote for the uncertainty and chaos of a left-leaning minority government. The Albanese government, but considerably worse, if that can be imagined. Let me conclude then with the observation that the 47th Parliament has the biggest crossbench in 80 years. Many people, including many journalists, seem to uncritically accept the claim that having more independence is a good thing and independent MPs are inherently morally superior to major party MPs. I disagree. The stability of the two-party system is a good thing. It has delivered many benefits to Australia. Stable majority government is a foundational requirement for achieving any serious reform and advancing our nation's prosperity. But majority government is at real risk in Australia, in large measure due to the cynical Green Left con job perpetrated by the political operatives behind the Teal movement and their big money backers. As the 2025 election approaches, the public interest will be well served by more critical scrutiny of the Teals and their moneyed mates, and more pointed questions about what the Teals intend to do should they hold the balance of power. And my message to all Australians is, if you do not like the idea of an unstable minority government with a strong Green Left bias, a government even worse than the Albanese Labor government, the only reliable way to head off that danger is to vote for your local Liberal or Nationals candidate. Thank you.
So many thanks to Paul Fletcher for a controversial speech, I think, Mr. Fletcher. So we come to questions and discussion, and we've got plenty of time. Our speaker's been exactly on time. So just taking up your final point, you made the point that the Teals and the Reps really have no weight at all, as distinct from the independents in the Senate, who are very important. But I note that the Teals in the Reps, they have no voting power at all, get a lot of media attention. I mean, for example, on the ABC recently, Zoe Daniel, in the week leading up to the end of the sitting, effectively got important interviews on ABC Radio National and I think on 7:30 for a piece of legislation she had no chance of even getting considered. So what's the kind of... how can the major parties, and it also affects Labor with respect to the Greens, how can the major parties overcome that sort of favouritism of journalists who just like independents and minor parties and their producers and others?
Look, the ABC has a very long track record, regrettably, of giving an amount of attention to historically the Greens, and they've done the same thing with the Teals, which is well out of proportion to the number of Australians who support them. And there is a lot of uncritical acceptance of the proposition, as I put it in the closing words of my speech, that independent MPs are inherently morally superior to major party MPs. I think it's important to push back on those assumptions, which is certainly what I'm seeking to do in this speech. And it's important to remind people of the connection between the composition of the House, the legislative branch of government, and then the strength or weakness of the executive branch of government. So these are fundamental features of our system. And that's why I'm making the argument that I am tonight. I can't disagree with you that ABC journalists seem very excited about the Teals. Zoe Daniel, of course, herself is a former ABC journalist. But the election will be decided by every Australian on the electoral roll and not by the ABC.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, sit down. Okay. Paul, thank you for your very informative speech tonight. We were very grateful. Two very short questions, which I think are interconnected. One is I do not understand how the Teals are considered independents. Why are they not considered a party? Second question is, when someone goes into government as a party, a member of a party, and then resigns and is allowed to stay in the parliament, I would suggest if you resign from a party, you should be resigning from the parliament.
That second issue is one that from time to time bedevils both of the major parties, as witness Senator Fatima Payman, for example, but certainly the Liberal Party has had its share of that as well. Actually, though, I think in our system, probably compared to some other countries, the number of times that happens is quite modest. Again, it's accepted as an uncontested wisdom amongst, journalists and those on the left that party discipline is a bad thing and it doesn't allow people to, explore their full democratic potential. My proposition tonight is that from the point of view of voters who are making a decision as to how they cast their vote and wanting to make an assessment of the likelihood that in casting that vote they will see outcomes consistent with what's been promised, party discipline is a good thing. And party discipline is is an important way in which the major parties put propositions to the Australian people and can then be expected to deliver on those propositions.
Thank you, Paul. Two quick questions. One, what is driving Simon Holmes' Accord? What is actually driving him? I can't believe it's anything to do with the climate. And secondly, why are the Teals all women?
I've been careful in my speech to confine myself to saying things that I think can be objectively proven and are backed by facts and data and evidence. So those are things, on both of those issues I don't particularly want to speculate. The one thing I would say is there is a lot of scrutiny, and it's perfectly appropriate scrutiny, about donations to the major parties and who makes those donations and how that links into policies. It's remarkable that there's been very little scrutiny of the donations made to the Teals and who those donations come from. In my view, the same expectations ought to apply to people making donations regardless of where they are on the political spectrum. But there seems to be an assumption from, at least from some journalists, that these questions don't need to be asked when it comes to those who are making significant, in some cases extremely significant donations to support Teal candidates.
Paul, thank you. I think your speech tonight's the first sign of leadership in the Liberal Party about their biggest problem. What the Teals have done to the Liberal Party, the DLP did to the Labor Party in the 50s, and they used the preferential system very effectively. But you can't just talk about money and you can't just talk about the ABC bias, because Donald Trump's already shown that having lots of money doesn't win elections necessarily, and we've got a lot of media out there. So isn't it time for the Liberal Party to do what you've done tonight as a whole and take the battle to the candidates, the Teals? And what is the best way you could do that apart from your speech?
We do think it's important to put the facts before voters, and voters will make up their mind. In addition to my speech, the Liberal Party put up a website, Teals Revealed, 2 or 3 weeks ago, which contains a lot of important information about the Teals. And we think that it's highly desirable that voters are informed about these issues. Bear in mind that at the last election there was something of a surprise factor, I think quite deliberately a surprise factor. That's not the case at this election, and also, as I've sought to emphasise and explain in my speech, we now have their voting track record. So we know what they've done and how they've conducted themselves. And as I argued in my speech, I think many people who voted Teal would be quite surprised. Now look, ultimately, every Australian voter is perfectly entitled to make their own choice. There's a marketplace of ideas. We, as the Liberal Party, need to make our case, and every party and every candidate needs to make their case. But as I also argued, when you vote for a Liberal candidate, you know what you're getting. This is an institution that's been around for 80 years, and there's a central ideological consistency. And while I'm critical of Labor on many grounds, I would say exactly the same thing about the Labor Party. In fact, the Labor Party's been around for considerably longer than the Liberal Party. So voters know what they're getting if they vote for one or other of the major parties. And the important principle is that whoever voters vote for, they should know what they're getting.
It's a very interesting talk. I must say, putting Labor in charge of the Treasury benches is like putting a fox in charge of a chicken coop. But at the last federal election, I put my Teal last, and I'm in Wentworth, and I had no doubt because I could see what was going on. I was at East Leagues Club one night, and they were all meeting there, and I was asking what their policies were, and I just got a blank look. So it's just I think they're just a wolf in sheep's clothing, personally, and I don't know how my electorate was supposed to be an educated electorate when you return people like that.
Again, I think the central principle is voters are entitled to make up their own mind. Voters are entitled to make whatever choice they want. All a political party can do, or a political candidate can do, is put before voters, okay, here are the things that we're going to do, here are what our policies are, and fundamentally I'm arguing that part of the Teal model was to be extremely circumspect in what they said about what they were going to do.
Thanks very much, Paul. When I speak to people who vote for independence, one of the things that they say to me is that they reflect the electorate. So, and I hear independents saying this as well, that I've spoken to my electorate and I've responded on their behalf. I'm answering this question in the way that my electorate wants me to. How do you counter that?
There's 125,000 people on the electoral roll in a electorate now, federal electorate, following the redistribution. So any member of parliament who seeks to give the impression that they've spoken to everybody, it's physically impossible. The reality is that if you're a Liberal MP, as I am, you are part of a community organisation which has existed for 80 years in the electorate, and the other members of the Liberal Party, you know, your local Liberals, of whom there are several hundred, are members of Rotary. They're parents at local schools. They're members of sports clubs. And of course, all of your day-to-day work as a local member of parliament is going to local events, engaging with local community organisations. The suggestion that an independent candidate in some way has superior connectivity with the community is just factually wrong. One of their affectations is to stand up in the parliament and say, my community does not support this. There's no basis for saying that. They're not going and conducting a statistically valid poll before every vote. But of course, the other fundamental point is, the classic Burkean liberal proposition, Edmund Burke, I hasten to add, not Tony Burke, Edmund Burke, that when you vote for an MP, what you're getting is ultimately their judgment as to how they vote on things, because that's the way our system works. So there's a lot of overblown claims made about, in some way, if you're an independent, that means you've got a better connection with your community. I just don't think that's right. Look, I'm not contesting for a second that if you're a Teal MP, of course you go to local community events and you engage with local community organisations. But the idea that you do that more effectively, more comprehensively, that you're more connected in some way is just baseless.
I've got a Zoom question here. Hang on. I've just got a Zoom question here. We've got plenty of time, okay? And I know I haven't... So that it's a question in relation to what you said about your own seat of Bradfield, and you got an increasing Labor vote in preferences. And the question says, as the Speaker will know, a large part of the success of the Teals was preferences from the Greens and Labor, apart from the different result you got. So what's the implication of a lower Labor vote and or a lower Green vote for the success of a Liberal Party candidate?
Well, the argument that I was making was that because there was a Teal and Labor was pushed into third place, for the first time, I think in the history of Bradfield, certainly the first time I've been the member, but I'd be pretty confident in saying the first time in the history of the seat, because Labor came third, the preferences of Labor voters were by definition distributed. So the simple point I'm making is that in some booths in the northern end of the electorate, not across the whole electorate by any means, but in the northern end of the electorate, up to approaching 30% of second preferences of Labor voters came to me as a Liberal candidate. Now, I don't interpret that as a personality cult at all. So precisely the opposite. I interpret it as a vote for the stability of the two-party system. In other words, if their preferred candidate could not get up, and that of course is what the preferential system is supposed to do, then their next preference was for the candidate of the other major party. Now, I'm a great believer in the innate good sense of the Australian electorate in total, and my electorate in particular, and I think that was a wise judgment.
Just tell us, the northern part of your electorate is...
Well, it's actually no longer in my electorate post-redistribution, but it was areas like Asquith, Hornsby, Waitara. Now, the relevance of citing those booths in particular is that those are usually the booths in which Labor does best in the electorate of Bradfield. So some of those booths, the Labor... In a couple of those booths on a two-party preferred basis, Labor wins them in a normal election, and in others, the two-party preferred Labor vote is the high 40s.
It would be fair to say they're lower socio-economic areas of your electorate?
In relative terms. In relative terms.
You already had a question. Okay, there's a question there, and I've got another one here.
Thank you. Will the Liberal Party be challenging the Teals' constant theme that they are independent? I say that because it strikes me that the only truly independent party of the right is in fact the coalition. It's not beholden to big business, not beholden to big unions, not beholden to billionaires. Thank you.
Well, we certainly believe that the degree of scrutiny that the Teals and their big money financial backers have received has been materially less than the degree of scrutiny which is applied to donations received by either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party. And there's no good basis for not subjecting the Teal operation and the Teal donations to the same level of scrutiny as the existing political parties.
I have a question here from Isabel. Allegra Spender spoke at the Sydney Institute recently and refuted that she votes with the Greens and Labor most of the time. What is your opinion on some Teals making this distinction and maintaining their independence?
Well, just to be clear, the numbers that I quoted are from a parliamentary library report. So I asked the parliamentary library to examine the voting record of the Teals, including Allegra, and that was up until, I think, September 2024. And that found that between 74% and 81% of the time, depending upon which Teal it was, that Member of Parliament had voted with the Greens. So that was an analysis of every division on a substantive vote on legislation. So they're not my numbers, they're numbers of the Parliamentary Library. I can't remember where Allegra stood between 74 and 81, but at the lowest, she voted 74% of the time, almost 3/4 of the time with the Greens. That's a simple fact.
Isn't some of the problem with the Liberal Party that they often sprout policies which are more in line with the Teals, going against the core values of your traditional Liberal voter?
Look, we stand to be judged by the electorate on the policies we put forward, and it's the nature of democracy. It's a competition, it's a contest. The simple point I'm making is we put forward a set of policies across a wide spectrum of areas, and people know what they're going to get when they vote Liberal. Whereas with the Teals, the amount of detail that was given on policy was vastly less, and that's meant there's been a huge amount of territory where they've done things which I'd suggest would be quite surprising to many of the people who voted for them.
A slightly contrary view. A lot of people have lost confidence just with the level of representation in the parliament, and I live in Warringah, and the effort there has been, well, Tony Abbott just rested on the oars for everything. He was never there other than fighting a few fires occasionally, literally. The effort from Zali Steagles in the community has been quite extensive. It's regular, it's informative, and at least there's some feeling that local issues are at least bubbling to the surface, and some platform is being given for that.
Look, I want to pick up that question. You won't be surprised to hear that respectfully I disagree with you. And I think it goes to our conception of what the responsibilities of our members of parliament are. One key responsibility is representing your electorate, attending local electorate functions, assisting constituents with difficulties with pensions or immigration matters, and so on. That's very important, keeping your constituents informed. But another key role is that it is from the legislature, from the parliament, that executive government is drawn. And the reason that Tony Abbott was not able to get to as many local functions as he would have liked to is that he was Prime Minister or Leader of the Opposition. You know, he was hosting the leaders of the G20. He was pretty busy. And that's our system. Our system is that when you vote for your local MP, that vote is about who's going to turn up to local community events, but it's also about the formation of executive government. My central proposition this evening is that when you vote for an independent, there is no answer as to what that independent is going to do in the formation of executive government. And unless we have a strong executive government, which means a strong majority in the parliament, then our country is weakened. Having a weak minority government is a bad thing for Australia. That is my argument. And the Teals are contributing materially to the risk of a weak government.
I have a question here about electoral reforms, and the questioner says that you almost passed Labor's legislation. It nearly passed with Liberal and National Party support for reforms, and the questioner is suggesting that these reforms would have been an assault on electoral competition because they were aimed at Teals and other independents.
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is it's well known that the Labor Party was advancing reforms, or changes might be a better word. It's well known that they were in discussions with us. It's also well known that we didn't feel that the legislation was in a form that was suitable for us to support. I can't predict what might happen in the future, but it's clear that it was not brought forward to be voted on last week. The set of issues, one of the points I made in my speech, is that we faced as a nation an unprecedented set of issues when amounts of $2 million and more were spent in individual electorates. And it is, I think it's hard to disagree with the proposition that if the Liberal Party had done that, or indeed if other parties, established parties had done that, there would be intense criticism that this massive ramp up in spending amounted to the Americanisation of Australian politics. It is surprising to me that there's been very little questioning of that fundamental fact. But what was that money used to do? That money was used to take somebody in several seats who had very little, if no public profile, and have saturation advertising for 2 or 3 months, massive billboards, for example, a billboard at Crow's Nest, which costs, as I understand it, well over $10,000 a week, which was advertising Kylie Tink for 2 or 3 months. Now, again, it's a competition. It's a competitive process. And there'll be people who will say, well, you lost and you're just whinging. But the point I'm making is that we have a policy framework dealing with issues including political donations and disclosure of donations, which is designed to weigh up a range of factors, including the capacity of people with very deep pockets to influence political outcomes. And so there's been very little questioning of what happened in a number of electorates based upon very substantial expenditure, unprecedented levels of expenditure. And the idea that that ought go without any investigation at all, I think is hard to defend.
So just give us an idea, in Bradfield or say Trent Zimmerman in North Sydney, what would the spend be roughly?
Look, I don't have those numbers to hand, but I quoted in my speech over 2.1 million. 2.1 million in Wentworth, 2.1 million in Kooyong, and in total across the 6 seats that were won, almost $10 million. So that's, an average of, 1.5, 1.7 million across those 6 seats. And it varied across the different seats, but those are unprecedented amounts of money to be spending on local campaigning.
Paul, I'm old enough to realise that you can tell people so much, but they have to experience it before they realise what you're saying is true. And the likely outcome of the next election is a minority Labor government. That's what we think, because first-term governments usually have not, except for 1931, collapsed. And that's what happened in 2010. If it became a Labor Teals government, how do you think this would impact on the sort of electorates they represent? Because then they would be kind of flushed out as being mostly green.
Look,
let's make this the final question and comment. Yeah.
Look, it's hard to speculate. Who was it who said it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future? My central argument is, if we end up with a weak minority government, a Green left government, that will be a bad thing for Australia. We are already drifting in terms of our prosperity, in terms of our economic management. We're seeing sustained attacks on the industries that generate our prosperity, like resources and like agriculture. There's a lot more damage that can be done in 3 years. So it is a pretty troubling scenario, and my argument is that one of the highly undesirable consequences of the Teal Green Left con job is that it increases the prospect of a weak Labor, Greens, Teal minority government.
Many thanks. So, a lot of people here tonight, and it's a hot night, so I'll just be very brief. Many thanks to Paul Fletcher for a very important speech, which was supported by a deal of empirical evidence and took a bit of work, and well done for that. And it's a great way to end the year. As one of our questioners said, we've had a Teal independent here, now we've got Paul Fletcher, and that's what we're about at the Sydney Institute. So for tonight, thank you, and you're welcome back next time. Thank you.